Good morning. If you've read the news this week, I have seen some strange headlines this week. One of the headlines that I saw was that in the United Kingdom now, and this is actually a quotation from them, they're going to start teaching school children that the only thing limiting your gender identity is your imagination. Now, I don't know about you, but I never had to do much imagination to figure out whether I was male or female. And I'm hearing a lot of strange things in this world. In Oregon this week, there's a woman who went to court, and the woman went to court to get her sex officially changed by the court. He was male, then became female, and now according to the court, his sex is non-binary. I don't even have a clue as to what that's talking about. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is not to try to talk about transgender or homosexual or gay or non-binary or whatever else. But if you watch the headlines, what you're going to see is that absolutes are disappearing. Everything's becoming, we can play around with it. What do you think it's like? Well, how do you feel about this? And the fact is that there are still absolutes, including the fact that what Paul's talking about in this message is, the absolute that he's talking about today is, Jesus Christ is going to return. It doesn't matter how you feel about it. It doesn't matter what you think about it. It doesn't matter what you believe. Some people think, I don't believe in Jesus. That's nice. He believes in you. He's coming back. And the absolute that we're talking about is, Jesus is going to return. Now, we start looking at verses 1 through 3. It begins with, "Now as to the times and the epochs, brethren, you have no need of anything to be written to you." And what we're going to see here, if we remember the context of chapter 4, end of chapter 4, we were talking about the rapture. The Thessalonians had a question. The question that they had was, hey, how about our relatives and our friends who have already died? Does that mean that they're just going to stay there and they're not coming back at all? And Paul was assuring them, no, they're going to be resurrected at the same time as the rapture. And not only are they going to be resurrected, but they're going to be the first ones resurrected. Then the people who are still alive are going to go up an instant after them. So that was the first question. But now Paul's saying is, I'm moving on to a different topic here, but still about the end times. And we'll see in verse 2, the topic we're going to be talking about is the day of the Lord. Now what's interesting is, again, I brought this up last week. I grew up in a culture, especially back in the late 70s, early 80s. I didn't even think about planning for what was going to happen in the year 2000. Because I knew by the time the year 2000 came, hey, that's it. We got rapture, tribulation, end times, we're into the millennium, whatever. There is no way we're ever going to make it to this next century. Well, I was obviously wrong. But if you didn't live through it, you don't know what I mean, but there was the furor that was triggered by the late great planet Earth. Everybody was trying to figure out when the end was coming. You had guys who were on the lunatic fringe like Harold Camping write about the exact day that the earth was going to end, or Christ was coming back. You've had all kinds of stuff going on. And the thing is that I started to realize later on when I look back at this, now that I've gone through that some, it's like, you know something? I don't think that mattered all that much. The important thing is that Jesus is coming back. And if you look at verse 1, when Paul says, "Now to the times and the epochs, brethren, you have no need of anything to be written to you." Two reasons for this. Number one, they had already grasped the concept that Christ was coming back. In that short period of time Paul had with them, they did a good job of understanding this. But the second thing I think Paul's trying to get across to them is, you need to know Christ is coming back. You really don't need to know the details. Now I have to admit, from a curiosity standpoint, there are very few things in the Bible that are more fun to study than the end times and trying to figure out what trumpet's going to blow when, what angel's coming when, what Christ is doing, who's going over what hill or whatever. But in our everyday Christian life, the important fact of all of it is Christ is returning. Not the order of all this, and even things, I believe in a premillennial view, I believe in a pre-tribulation rapture. But I can still fellowship with people who hold other views because, frankly, that's not as important as understanding that Christ is returning. And they still believe that Christ is returning. Now, if we keep looking at these verses, it says in verse 2, "For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night." The first thing we need to talk about a little bit is, what is the day of the Lord? Because there is legitimate debate on this. One of the things, if you talk to if you talk to someone who's not pre-trib, pre-mill, you're going to get a completely different answer. But even among people who are pre-trib, pre-mill, one question is the day of the Lord one exact day? Is it a few days? Is it a week? Or, as I think it probably is here, the day of the Lord is probably talking about the tribulation period, and the start of it is the start of the day of the Lord. But this tribulation period, this 7-year period where literally all hell's going to break loose, is what they're talking about. Now, again, remember, this is in the context of the thing that's important is Christ is coming back. But he has given them a few little details here. And what he's saying regarding this day of the Lord is that in this point in time, people are going to be saying, peace and safety, and then destruction will come upon them suddenly. One of the things that's interesting is, if you look at this idea of peace and safety, okay. Yeah, I got my verses out of order here. When they're saying peace and safety, then destruction will come on them like a birth pangs, like a child upon a woman. That's right. I was in verse 2. I was reading verse 3. I'm like, this doesn't match. Verse 2, for you yourselves know well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. I'm looking for the phrase thief in the night, and it's like, it's not there in the verse. I'm reading the wrong verse, that's why. Have you ever had a break-in? You know what a thief in the night is in a different way than if you haven't had a break-in. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I spent the night with my grandparents. And everybody went out, and it was 4th of July. And one of the things that happened is that in the morning, we got a phone call from my parents, and they said somebody broke in. They sold the telescope, they stole the television, and they stole the tape recorder. They must have been on like a tea trip or something like that. But they got all of those things, and they took them out of the house. And I got to say this, to this day, I feel funny and weird leaving the house to go out to a 4th of July celebration. There's something a little weird about that where it's just kind of like, do I go or do I not go? Because there's still this thing about this break-in. When I lived in New Carleton before I met Linda, I lived in a house by myself. Twice I was broken into in New Carleton. Unfortunately, we had about, I think they had about 100 break-ins in about a 3-month period, and the city neglected to tell the residents about this. In both cases, I was out at church activities. And in both cases, there were very large losses. I lost a high-end camera outfit. It's funny, it was probably the first one happened about 3 weeks after the death of my sister, which was like a week before Christmas. And things were so depressed in the family after losing my 21-year-old sister that I decided I was going to withdraw a lot of my money out of the bank. Didn't have a lot, but I was going to take it out, and I was going to buy some really nice Christmas presents for the family. Well, I withdrew that money, and that was the night they decided to break in. So all of that was stolen. All told, between jewelry that was taken, between money, between items, I think the one time they probably got close to $10,000 that night. If you've ever been through that, you realize it affects you. You don't see the world the same way afterward. If you haven't been through it, you can kind of relate to it, but you don't really get what it means. If you've been through that, and then you look at this as the day of the Lord coming as like a thief in the night, it has a different meaning to you. There's a sudden, startling shock to it that you can't quite put into perspective otherwise. The fact is, it's something that's unexpected and that we can't control. And that's what's going to happen for the people who are unsaved. This day of the Lord, this judgment is coming. They're not going to have warning on this. It's just all of a sudden going to be there. In addition to that, people are crying peace and safety. Have you ever looked around at the false security in the world today? I look at the Iran deal that was negotiated. No matter what you believe about that deal. I mean, like what? A week after the deal, the Iranians are coming out saying, we're not going to follow this. And what? Several weeks afterward, they're firing intermediate and long-range missile tests, which are against the agreement. Yet everyone's proclaiming, we got peace, we got a deal. Look at the UN. The UN is the savior of the world in many cases. They're going to go and they're going to bring peace to the world. What's happening in Central African Republic and several other African nations? Well, they did a UN study, and you know what they found out? The guys they've hired as the peacekeepers over there, their primary mission is they're going over and raping children. That's the primary thing they're doing. There's no peace coming out of that. It's a joke if you look at it. The whole Middle East, every time you look at the Middle East, it seems like every 30 minutes somebody's coming out with a new Middle East peace plan. Does it work? No. People are screaming, peace and safety, peace and safety. It's not there. It's an illusion. And we will not have that as long as we're on the earth. Not only that, if we look also at verses 2 and 3, it also says, then destruction will come upon them suddenly like birth pangs upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. When people were running the marathon in Boston, they didn't think that as they're coming to the finish line, maybe the end of the marathon was going to be death or dismemberment. It was sudden. It was unexpected. Right into this morning. I didn't expect to wake up and look at headlines and find out that at least 20 people were killed in a nightclub in Florida by a shooter, and that at least 40 or 50 more were sent to the hospital by him. Evidently, the guy walked into a gay dance hall with an assault rifle, a handgun, and if the reports are right, with a suicide vest on as well. None of this is expected. It just happens and falls upon us, and there's nothing we can do about it. This is what it's talking about for the end times, but it's going to be far worse. And as far as the birth pangs, it's funny. Every time I think of birth, there's one thing that I've been blamed for most of my life, and that's my birth. Now that may sound strange, okay? But there's a reason for this. And in truth, I don't even blame my mother for blaming me in this case. I was a 10-month baby. A full 10 months, okay? That's not a nice thing for a woman to endure. I was supposed to be, kind of fitting, I was supposed to be born on Halloween. Didn't happen, I was born a month later. Would have explained a lot, but didn't happen, I was born a month later. But the fact is that even though I was a 10-month baby, even though it took that extra month of labor and I assume screaming and hollering and panic and whatever else, the fact is eventually I arrived. Eventually it was there. And you know something else? I can't relate to this, but I'm sure women who had children can. When it gets to a certain point, there's nothing you can do to stop it. That kid's on the way and it's coming, period. And again, I can't personally vouch for that, but I believe you. But the fact is, that's the same thing that's happening here is Christ is returning, he's on the way, there's not a thing you can do about it. Now again, he's given us the details here, but the details aren't the important thing, because the important thing is the absolute we're talking about. The absolute is Christ is returning. We can all agree on that. And when it comes, it's going to be spectacular. Now if we continue on verse 4, the next question we've got is, okay, so what? Christ's returning. What's the big deal? How should it affect us? What should it matter? Now what? Well, now what starts with verse 4, which says, but you, brethren, are not in darkness, that the day should overtake you like a thief. For you are all sons of light and sons of day. We are not of night nor of darkness. The first thing I thought of when I read this is 1 John 1:7. 1 John 1:7 said, but if we walk in the light, as he himself is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus his Son cleanses us from all sin. This is talking about believers and the fact that all believers are in the light. And as such, we have fellowship with each other because we are in the light. The fact is, I don't believe we're actually going to see this day of the Lord. I believe the believers are going to be taken out with the rapture just before the day of the Lord. That's one of the reasons why I don't think we're going to be in darkness. But in addition to that, the fact is that we have a special relationship with God and we are in light. And several things we can see from that. Number one, if you are in the light, you have the ability to see right from wrong. It's funny. I used to do this myself, and maybe I do sometimes still. I try not to. But it's easy to get upset with non-believers. Oh, that person's doing these terrible sins. This person's doing these horrible things. Yeah? What did you expect? They're a non-believer. Their moral code is not there are absolutes. Their moral code is everything can be adjusted. Everything's according to feelings in a lot of cases. And instead of getting mad at them, maybe we need to look at them and say, you know something? The key is they need to understand and learn about Jesus Christ and come to Christ. Because the fact is, if an unbeliever is sinning, that's not really the issue, because they're already dead in their sins. The fact of how many sins they're doing doesn't really make that much of a difference. The other thing we should be able to see from this walking in the light is, it's a reminder to us that as fellowship with each other, we've talked about this before, there is a difference between a creation of God and a child of God. One of the lies that's told to us in the world is, we're all children of God. Not according to John 1:12, we're not. John 1:12 said that Christ came to give us the power to become sons of God. The fact is, everyone is a creation of God. Not everyone's a child of God. Children of God are specifically people who have become believers in Jesus Christ. That's the only way to become a child of God. That means we have a relationship with God. And not only that, it's just, there's no little bit relationship or something like you're either a child of God or you're not. I am a child of my biological parents. It's not like, well, maybe kind of, sort of. Now, admittedly, with genetic engineering, I know they're talking about 3-parent children, literally, and things like that. I don't know what's going to happen, but child of God is simple. You're either a child of God or you're not a child of God. It's that simple. There's no halfway in between with that. Now, if we continue on and we say, okay, so now what do? We look in verse 6, and verse 6 starts with the word therefore. At least in the original, it starts with the word therefore. And when we see that word, I like to take notice of it, and I like to say, okay, we've just been presented with some things, now we've got to decide what to do with them. And Paul said, so then let us not sleep as others do, but let us be alert and sober. For those who sleep do their sleeping at night, and those who get drunk at night. And I have to admit, these verses are a little unusual in one respect, we'll get to in a minute. But the first thing I see here is when Paul is saying that we need to be alert and sober, is that Paul is saying we have a mission, we have a purpose. We're not just wandering around not knowing what to do. The purpose is to disciple people, to edify the church, and to witness to people about Jesus Christ. Notice I did not say our purpose is to get people saved. The reason is, it's up to God when a person comes to save. Our job is to witness. Our job has never been to save anyone because we don't have that power. The Holy Spirit will open their eyes, but our job is to witness to people and show them the gospel and show them the love of Christ. That's because we have a mission. God left us here to do something. And then it says, not sleep as others sleep. Now, my first question when I read that is, what? We don't sleep at night? We sleep during the day? That doesn't make sense. It means the manner. We hang upside like a bat? No, that doesn't make any sense. I have to admit, when I look at the phrasing in verse 7, it's a little strange, although I think I know the meaning. Because it says, for those who sleep do their sleeping at night. Okay, so do I. So do most of you, I would assume. So I don't think he's trying to say don't sleep at night, obviously. But if we continue on here, he's talking and says, and those who get drunk at night. Notice also he said those who get drunk, not those who drink. There's a difference between the two. But I think what he's saying here is, people who are in sin like to do it in the dark because the sin is not exposed. It's almost like, and I don't mean to put people down because I don't mean it this way, but it's almost like when you go into a dark room and you flip the light on, you see all the roaches go scurrying away. It's funny, sometimes when people are sinning, you expose light to it and all of a sudden it's like, ugh. Have you ever walked into a room? I haven't. Many of you I'm sure have. And there's people in that room just cursing back and forth and they're telling stories and man, they got a story about what they did here and there and stuff. And you walk into the room, oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that. He's a Christian. He's a good guy. He's a man of God. He's whatever, okay? The fact is, you don't even have to say anything. And when you walk into the room, the light walks into the room and all of a sudden they go, whoops, sin's exposed. Doesn't always work that way. I mean, sometimes the people will deliberately sin more to show you what they can do. But the fact is that often just the light exposing it changes things. So I think the point of these verses, I'm not going to pick apart this idea of sleeping at night and not sleeping at night. What I am trying to say is the point of these verses is sin is of the darkness, living for Christ is of the light. And living in the light should be our nature because of how we've changed. Now the other thing we see in verse 8 says, but since we are of the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet, the hope of salvation. Now one thing I find interesting, here we start hearing about the protective armor of God. And I can't even count the number of sermons I've heard on the armor of God, and you probably have too. I'm not going to give you a big sermon on the armor of God today, okay? Because sometimes I think we miss the point. Sometimes we get down to, the helmet means this, the breastplate means this, we've got the belly button that means that, we've got the cufflink that means... No, the fact is that all of the things they're talking about, faith, righteousness, hope, love, etc., they all have a place in protecting us and living a Christian life. But I want to concentrate here on a couple of things, because number one, if you were to look at Ephesians 6:14, you'd find out he talks about the breastplate of righteousness. Here it's a breastplate of faith and a breastplate of I'll get it right. The breastplate of love. My point is, don't get hung up on the fact that he changed from one to the other, because again, he's just trying to say all of these things are important. All of these things need to cover us and be armored. And also, it's in context. I think if you said this today, you'd probably have the Kevlar vest of faith instead of the breastplate of faith. We'd understand that. He's using the analogy of that time that people would understand. But what I want to concentrate on especially is the end of that verse, which says, and the helmet, the hope of salvation. And the reason I want to bring that out is no matter what armor of God you look at, salvation is always a portion of it, a part of it. And the reason it's critical is this. If we do not have salvation, none of the other armor makes any difference, because we're not a child of God. We're not even in the club. It's almost like we got a club that's you're either a member or not. I actually take one of my computer networking company that I own. One of the things we do quite a bit is we service a lot of country clubs. You can't just walk into a club and say, you can't walk into Congressional Country Club and say, I think I'm going to have dinner here tonight, unless you're a member. It's that simple. I've eaten there because I was doing work there and they've let me eat there, but typically you cannot walk in and just say, I'm going to walk in. It doesn't work that way. You're a member or you're not. Well, you know something? Same thing with the family of God. You're a member or you're not. There's no halfway in between. I had to laugh years ago. If you're older, you'll understand who I mean. How many of you guys remember Groucho Marx? Okay, enough of you. The younger people, bear with me. He was a guy who was on television in the movies, part of the Marx Brothers. Okay, Groucho Marx was offered a membership in the Hillside Country Club in Los Angeles years and years ago. Many years ago, obviously. And one of the rules they had, as disgusting as this rule was, one of the rules was no Jews. And it wasn't even hidden. It was written right in writing. No Jews allowed in this country club. No Jewish members, period. Now today we look at that and we go, whoa, you're kidding me. But that was a rule back then in that club. But they made a special exception because they wanted Groucho Marx to be in their club. And Groucho Marx actually took him up on it and joined the club. But there was a restriction on him. They said, you can join the club, we'll make an exception, but you can't go in the swimming pool. I don't know if they thought that Jewish germs would get on them or what, but I mean, they literally said, you can't go in the swimming pool. You know what Groucho's response was? Quote, my daughter's only half Jewish. Can she wade in up to her knees? I love that response. But the fact is, what it shows is this. There is no halfway in, up to our knees, wading into the family of God. We're either in or we're not. There's no in between. There's no wading in. If you are a child of God, then you have the helmet of salvation, and all these other parts of the armor are important. If you're not a child of God, you're not a member of the club, you're not getting in. It's that simple. Nothing in between. Now, if we continue looking in the verses, we start in verse 9. It said, for God has not destined us for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live together with him. The first thing we want to look at here is it says, God has not destined us for wrath, but for salvation. Salvation is the opposite of wrath. Salvation is being taken out of the wrath. The fact is also, if we look at this, it says, God has not destined us for wrath. You know, that may surprise some people. Do you have the mindset that, all right, I'm a believer, but if I do something wrong, God's going to smack me down. God's going to turn his back on me. God's going to hate me. God's going to get me. You ever get that feeling? It's kind of a natural thing. I mean, if we offended a human, we think that way. But if we offended God, sometimes we got that idea in our head. And one thing to remember here, God will chastise his children. He will bring them back and correct them. Chastising is different than wrath. Think about it as a parent. You correct your child. When the child is corrected, you stop the punishment. You stop the correction. Wrath, if you're taking your wrath out on somebody, you're going to utterly destroy them. And it doesn't matter if they're corrected or not. You're going to destroy them. You're going to obliterate them. Now, what's interesting is, I've done this before, but I went back again this week and did a word study on the word orge, which is the word right here used for wrath in the Greek. And if you look up the word orge in the New Testament, you'll find that it appears 36 times. Of those 36 times, twice it's talking about the wrath of the government coming on people who disobey the government. But that doesn't really relate to God there. 5 times it's telling believers not to demonstrate wrath. So it's talking about our behavior. Okay. The other 29 times are all in reference to the wrath of God. Of those 29 times, twice it's referring to God's wrath on the Pharisees and Sadducees. Okay? 9 times it's referring to God's wrath on unbelieving Jews or unbelieving Israel. For example, when Israel was in the desert, with the New Testament looking back on that, talking about how God had his wrath on them and never allowed them to come out. 15 times it's talking about God's wrath on unbelievers in general or on end times unbelievers. 3 times it's talking about believers being spared from God's wrath. But you know how many times it talks about God's wrath on a believer or on one of his children or on someone who's saved? 0. You will not find a single verse in the New Testament that talks about God's wrath being poured out on a child of God. The reason? God doesn't take wrath out on his children. He will correct us. But if we turn around, if we repent and we turn from what we're doing, and God has corrected us, there's no need for God to continue to carry out wrath on us. The reason? Because there was wrath upon us and Jesus Christ already took that wrath. Jesus Christ is the one who received the wrath and paid the penalty. That's why we don't have to be under God's wrath. Now, something else that's one of the modern stories we hear today is that God is love, and because God is love, God doesn't have wrath and doesn't take wrath out on people. Okay? 2 things. Number 1, whoever said that didn't read the Bible. We've talked before about God is a loving God. But how that phrase, God is love, has been twisted. It only appears twice in the Bible, and both times in 1 John 4, and it's taken out of context. God is a loving God. No question. What he does is magnanimous, okay? But if you start with the premise God is love, then that means, well, God is love, therefore he can't punish, therefore he can't send anyone to hell, therefore he can't have wrath. God is a holy God. That's repeated hundreds of times in the Bible. Not twice and not out of context. And a holy God has wrath. That wrath that was taken out on Jesus Christ for us, and the wrath that's going to come upon unbelievers. Unbelievers will suffer God's wrath. Satan will also suffer God's wrath. Demons will suffer God's wrath. But unbelievers are going to suffer God's wrath. And again, what it comes down to is, are you in the family? And if you are, you're never going to experience God's wrath. Outside the family, you will be under God's wrath. It's that simple. And it's amazing to me and overwhelming to me to think that no matter what I've done, God's not going to take out wrath on me, because he never takes out his wrath on his children. It's that simple. Now, if we go to verse 10 again, it says, actually starting in verse 9, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, that whether we are awake or asleep, and remember, that's a synonym he's using for alive or dead. Now, we've seen that in chapter 4. We may live together with him. Did you ever think about this point of perspective? It doesn't really matter to God if you're alive or dead. Either way, we're supposed to be serving God. It's funny. We think of death as this point in time when everything... No, it doesn't end then. All we're doing is transitioning from earth to heaven. That's what death is. It's not like we all of a sudden stop living. We're still alive no matter what. It's just that we're alive with God or we're alive here physically on the earth. The fact is, it doesn't matter whether we're alive or dead, we're supposed to be serving God. We're supposed to be living for Christ. That's our goal, period. And if we look at verse 11 is interesting. It says, therefore, encourage one another and build up one another, just as you also are doing. First off, just as you also are doing, says the Thessalonians were already doing this. They were doing a good job. It wasn't a lecture, but he was saying, here are the things that need to be done. And it first off says, encourage one another. I have a question for you. Why encourage one another? We all walk around, hey, have a good day. Everything cool today, right? A lot of times it's a very hollow phrase. You ever walk up to somebody and say, how you doing today? And the person says, not well. Sometimes they'll talk to you. I've had people, you say, not well, and they'll go, oh, good, have a nice day, bye. They didn't mean it. It was a greeting, that was it. When he says encourage here, he's not talking about just encourage, whatever. What he's saying is encourage, and why? What is the basis for that encouragement? Number one, it's based on the fact that we're saved and part of the family of God. Number two, it's based on the fact that we are not going to suffer God's wrath. And number three, another absolute that we have is, it's based on the fact that Jesus Christ is going to return, period. Those are three pretty good absolutes: salvation, no wrath, and the return of Christ. And when we see that, we can say, you know something? There is a reason to be encouraged. If anyone has a right to be happy on this planet, it's Christians. We're not going to suffer God's wrath. We're going to heaven. We're not going to hell. That's pretty good. And even on the earth. So many times it's easy to get discouraged, and I realize, wait a second. Part of God's plan, He's got a plan for me, I'm part of His family, and God cares about me. Makes a big difference on my outlook. It's a reason to be encouraged. That's why I think Paul's saying to encourage one another. He also tells them to build up one another. We've talked about each one using our spiritual gifts to edify the church before. We're to be edifying each other, to be building each other up within the church. And if anyone has a reason for that, it's believers. Now we look through this, and I want to review a few things and talk about a little bit of application here. Number one, Christ's return, to remember this, Christ's return is more important than the details about how He's going to return. It's not wrong to study them. And not only that, if you look at the book of Revelation, it actually has a promise of a blessing for those who study. So if you want to study it, great, study it. And I've studied it myself. But the point is, when it comes down to your studying, study it, enjoy it, find it fascinating, but then realize, wait a second, the key here is Christ is returning. And not only that, but Christ is returning, and we need to live like Christ is returning. It's an old expression, but we need to live like Christ is coming back tomorrow. But we need to plan for if He's not coming back for 100 years. The fact is that our life should be reflective of the fact that Christ could show up at any moment. And because of that, we have to look at things like redeeming the time, making the best use of our time. We don't know that we have, if you've got unsaved friends and they don't know the gospel, you don't know that you got a year to tell them. You don't know that you got 2 years left. Even if the end of the world doesn't come, they could get hit by a bus, or so could you. So could I. I hope not, but it could. But the fact is that the end of the world could come at any point in time. Not only that, if we're going to live like Christ is returning, we need to be edifying the church, building one another up. And we also need to be doing three key things in that edification: discipling each other, witnessing to the unsaved, and encouraging one another, showing love to one another within the church, within the body. The other thing I think that's important is not just what we do, but how we think when we think about Christ as returning. One thing that was always interesting is, in my line of work, aside from owning the networking company and having a few employees, I worked for many, many years, several decades, as a senior network engineer. And what's interesting is sometimes when I go in, when I get called in, sometimes, for the customers we have now, we kind of manage everything, and it's usually not too bad. But I used to have other networking companies call me in as their expert. And a lot of times when I got called in, it was for the worst of circumstances. A server was in big trouble, the network wasn't working, nothing was communicating. And I'd walk in the door, and the people would know me, and I'd walk in the door, and the look on their face would change. And I'd just walk in, no matter what it was, hey, it's okay. We're going to take care of this. I'll get it back up and running. Even though I've got to restore your whole server, we'll get it running. You're not going to lose anything. And the fact is, it's funny, because I'd walk in the building, and it'd be like, literally, you've heard the expression, chickens with their heads cut off. That's exactly what it looked like. I mean, I'm not kidding. I've walked into places when the network was down and found women and men oh, sorry, in this case, women, not an insult to women, but I found women with their heads on their desk in tears because the network was down. I wish I were kidding. I have found men screaming at people because the network was down. Everybody handles it differently. But people don't like it when the network's down. But all of a sudden, they look at me and they go, you know something? He can fix it. And it would work out. Each time I never left it, they never not got fixed. But the fact is that by the knowledge that it could be taken care of, their attitude would change. You know something? Our attitude needs to change by the knowledge that Christ is coming back. The fact that Christ is coming back should mean we live differently than if we didn't know that. Again, that's an absolute. The world wants to tell us there's no absolutes. The world wants to use terms like non-binary or whatever, okay? And that imagination limits your gender identity. No, it doesn't. There are absolutes in the world, but the absolute here is Christ is returning. And because Christ is returning, it should affect our behavior. It's that simple. It should affect our mental mindset for how we live. We should remember that we have a relationship with God no matter what. And that should change us. And as far as application goes, I want to go back to this. I want to remind us there are absolutes. Number one, Christ will return. I've said this before, I'm going to say it one more time just for the sake of saying it. Christ will return. Number two, we will not suffer the wrath of God. And number three, as believers, anyone who's a believer will live with God forever. If you're not a believer, that doesn't apply. And it can apply if you become a believer. But if we're a believer, we can trust in all three of those things and they will happen. Let's go ahead and close in prayer.